Hey babe, do you love cookies? Are you fascinated by cults and true crime? Well, you've come to the right place. Today is part 2 of my brand new series where I decorate a cookie and tell you something about cults. The Cult Education Institute lists these 10 warning signs. 1. Absolute authoritarianism without accountability. 2. Zero tolerance for criticism or questions. 3. Lack of meaningful financial disclosure regarding the budget. 4. Unreasonable fears about the outside world that often involve evil conspiracies and persecutions. 5. A belief that former followers are always wrong for leaving and there is never a legitimate reason for anyone else to leave. 6. Abuse of members. 7. Records, books, articles, or programs documenting the abuses of the leader or group. 8. Followers feeling that they are never able to be good enough. 9. A belief that the leader is right at all times. 10. A belief that the leader is the exclusive means of knowing truth or giving validation. Today we're going to talk about the murder of Dawn Hacheney and the Christ Community Church. It's December 26, 1997 in Bremerton, Washington. The police are called to a house on fire where they discover the body of Dawn Hacheney. Her husband Nick arrives home just after 10 a.m. He says he and his wife had opened their presents, and then she wasn't feeling well, so she had taken some Benadryl around 2 a.m. This made sense to the coroner because it had appeared that Dawn hadn't tried to get out of bed at all. When they found her body, she was lying on her side. So we're going to talk about Dawn a little bit. She was born December 5th, 1969, to parents Donald and Diana. She was the oldest of 4. All of them were raised in Bremerton, Washington. Dawn's mom suffered depression and had an affair when Dawn was 11. She had left the family and had a baby with this other man before returning home with the baby. Dawn felt pushed to make her mom happy and became very ambitious. She was a champion speller and ended up meeting President Ronald Reagan. She became Bremerton Christian School's valedictorian in 1988. She went to the Northwest College of Assemblies of God, also known as Northwest Bible College, where she met Nick, who was also born and raised in the same area. Nick did not have a stable home life. His father was distant, his mom ran a daycare and fostered children. She was frequently overwhelmed. Nick would later say he felt she never loved him and felt that she preferred his siblings and foster kids to him. His mom also suffered depression, and Nick felt very alone and eventually turned to the Bible. When Nick and Dawn met, her friends didn't like him at all, and they said he was pushy, arrogant, and cocky. They felt Dawn would become more muted and reserved and shy when she was with Nick. After 2 years, Dawn got her AA degree, Nick proposed, and they got married on April 20th, 1991. Dawn started working at a credit union, and Nick began pursuing work as a youth pastor at Christ Community Church on Bainbridge Island outside of Seattle. As time went on, Dawn's friends felt that she deferred to Nick, even though it made her uncomfortable. She believed that it was God's plan for a woman to submit to her husband, and it was the greatest gift that a woman could give a man. Nick's dream was to work at Christ Community Church because of his youth pastor, P.B. Smith. P.B. Smith was now leading the church with another man named Robert Biley. Robert was a grandiose personality, a little odd for church leadership. He was strict and extreme in his approach. He was neither sympathetic nor empathetic. He also had no theological training, but somehow was still promoted to pastor. His sermons were theatrical and included fringe beliefs. Robert started a deliverance counseling program, which included intense prayer and screaming at demons to exit the afflicted church members. This was very new to the congregation. They asked very personal questions about sex and pushed ideas about homosexuality, pro-life ideology, and there were heavy themes of shame and guilt throughout. Nick was accepted as youth pastor, but PB wasn't really in charge anymore. Robert had begun to claim that he was an apostle of God and had a direct relationship with him. God talked to him directly. Most members seemed to be on board. Some even felt that they could also hear God's voice. Some were scared into submission, and some called him a false apostle. Anyone who questioned him was excommunicated. One man was made an example of in a 10-page letter that was circulated around the church. He and his family were expelled. Robert insisted on homeschooling, on changing diets, and on dressing more modestly. He ignored Nick mostly, but then Nick came to him and complained of PB's warmth and charisma and asked for mentorship. Nick wanted power, and Robert saw it as an opportunity to use Nick to get rid of PB. Robert wanted full control. In 1997, Nick and Dawn bought a fixer-upper and spent the winter and spring remodeling, but eventually ran out of money and had way too much debt. On the outside, they seemed like a happy couple, but the debt was already spiraling. In a lunch with a friend, Dawn mentioned a potential separation, and the friend said, "If that ever happens, you can come and live with me." The debt wasn't only renovation related. Nick was very bad with money. He spent money without restraint. He also began pouring money into a Christian youth camp that he wanted to open. He was certain it was what God wanted for him. Sandy Glass, a congregant, also claimed that God had shown her a vision of a new church on the exact same property Nick had seen under his leadership with her help and support. Sandy had also seen a lot of hardship. Her boyfriend had died of illness, her father died in a construction accident, and her brother was an addict. Sandy tried her best to be a good wife and mother, but also had a spending problem. They either fought or Jimmy left and drank. He spent many nights at the bar, avoiding his home. They eventually started attending deliverance counseling for help with their marriage, with Nick. Jimmy's parents were skeptical and doubted Nick's qualifications and ability to help. They thought Nick was too invested in Sandy. Nick was calling her at all hours, and her receptiveness was also very obvious to the family and the other congregates. For example, one time he called her while she was hosting a party, and she left the party and spent 45 minutes on the phone with him. But Sandy wasn't the only person that Nick was interested in. He was also interested in many of the women that he counseled, prying into their sex life too much. One woman complained to Robert, and she wasn't the only one. Pastor Robert's wife also became troubled and approached Nick. She reminded him of his wife and told him that he was being too nosy. Unsurprisingly, he just brushed her off. Soon, PB was pushed out, and he and his wife went off to do missionary work. Dawn was beginning to notice Nick's behavior, and many congregants complained to Robert with concerns about the counseling sessions, but Robert was slow to act and very indifferent towards these concerns. Eventually, Robert had no choice but to take action. Instead of talking to Nick, he pulled Sandy aside and reprimanded her. She didn't take that well and accused him of not appreciating her ability to communicate directly with God. She said he didn't appreciate her gifts. She told him that God wanted her and Nick to be together. Eventually, Nick and Sandy stopped hiding their relationship altogether. At one point, one of Sandy's kids told their dad that Sandy had said Nick would be their new stepdad after Jimmy died. Jimmy refused to believe that they were having an affair. Dawn took responsibility for Nick cheating, as if she wasn't good enough. Her friends had tried their best to reassure her. She wanted to have children too, but Nick had no desire for children whatsoever. In the days leading up to Dawn's death, Nick began to seem exhausted, and many women seemed to demand his time and attention. Sandy was pushing him really hard about the youth camp. She insisted that it was God's will. On Christmas Day, Dawn woke up with a cold, feeling terrible, but she wasn't one to disappoint. So they went to the mainland to go and visit her family, and after that, they played board games with PB's family, and Nick made plans with Lindsay, PB's daughter, to go hunting the next morning. That night was the last night anyone saw Dawn. The next morning, Nick met Lindsay and friends to go hunting before dawn. There were no animals out, so they decided to call it a day around 9 a.m. They had breakfast in town at a local diner where Nick suddenly jumped up and declared that he and Dawn still had yet to open their presents. He asked for the check and rushed home. The receipt says that he paid around 9:30 a.m. He would arrive home a little bit after 10 to hear that his wife had been killed in a fire. Investigators believe the fire started in the bedroom due to a faulty space heater and was accelerated by an abundance of wrapping paper and propane tanks near the headboard on one side of the bed. Nick explained that they had opened their presents the night before and then headed directly to bed without picking up because Dawn wasn't feeling well. The propane tanks were actually a gift to him from Dawn because they were still using space heaters throughout the home during the renovation. Overall, this seemed to be an accident to investigators. All too often in the winter, faulty space heaters cause fires. It's tragic, but common. Once the scene had been cleared, Pastor Robert arrived to comfort Nick. When Nick explained what happened, Robert immediately suggested that they try to raise her from the dead with the power of prayer. His sermons at the church had come to include the belief that those of the truest faith had the power to resurrect and be resurrected from the dead. This alarmed Nick, and he insisted that no one pray over Dawn because she had been so badly burned and would be in terrible pain. This struck Robert as strange because he had always known Nick to be one of the most faithful and devoted. Robert also found it strange that Nick asked him to be the one to inform Dawn's parents of her death. Nick said, "I just can't bring myself." The congregation was shocked and formed a prayer chain to pray for Dawn's soul. Mary Glass, Sandy's mother, didn't buy the explanation that Dawn's death was a tragic accident because she knew about their marriage troubles and was aware of some of Nick's behavior with women in the congregation, including her own daughter, Sandy. When she told her husband about her concerns, he dismissed it as something that the police would look into and prosecute if Nick really was involved. A few days later, the death was officially ruled accidental, and they handed off the investigation to Safeco Insurance Company, who had already received Nick's life insurance claim. The church community held a celebration of life where Nick gave a 45-minute eulogy. Pastor's gonna pastor, I guess. Nick moved in with P.B. Smith's family. Sometimes he seemed cold and detached, and other times he seemed a little too grief-stricken. Lindsay, P.B.'s daughter, found a collage that she had made of Dawn stuffed in the back of the closet in the room that he was staying in, and she found it strange, but eventually decided it was just too hard on Nick to see it all the time. He became rude, callous, and bizarre, snubbing neighbors and using women at church as confidants, leaning too heavily on his widower status. Everyone just said, "Well, that's just how Nick grieves," and some even carried on sexual relationships, believing it's what God wanted. Nick even slept with Dawn's mother shortly after Dawn's death. Nick continues to abuse his congregation for a few years until the reports to the church board were too numerous to ignore. In the spring of 2001, Nick was kicked out of Christ Community Church. Nick did not take this well. Then, in April 10th, 2001, Sandy Glass and her lawyer sat with the DA, offering her immunity in exchange for her testimony about the murder of Dawn Hacheney. According to Sandy, Nick called her that morning and said, "I did it," and that was it. Sandy said it took her weeks to ask for clarification. He said he had given her an overdose of Benadryl, covered her face with a plastic bag, and smothered her. She was still alive and awake and knew what he was doing. He then put wrapping paper and propane tanks around her body and set up the space heater so it would cause a fire, and then he left to go hunting. When asked why she had waited so long to come forward, she said she was worried about losing her kids, and she said that she had been manipulated by Nick, who said it was just what God wanted. At some point, she learned that he wasn't only sleeping with her, but with other women, and felt used and manipulated. This was enough for investigators to reopen the case. They reviewed the evidence and re-interviewed the witnesses. They learned about all of Nick's affairs, and also that the autopsy had revealed no soot in her lungs or carbon monoxide in her blood. Now, they had attributed this to a rare esophageal spasm instead of digging deeper, because after all, it was a pastor's wife. Along with these obvious signs that Dawn had died before the fire started, the autopsy also revealed toxic levels of Benadryl, approximately 5 times the normal dosage. The prosecutors decided to move forward, issuing a warrant for Nick's arrest, and the pathologist changed the cause of death to homicide. On September 12, 2001, Nick was arrested for murder. Of course he was innocent, he says. This is a conspiracy by the members of Christ Community Church. You have no idea what these people are capable of. Yada yada. He was booked on first-degree murder with bail set at $750,000. One of the worst parts about this case is that After collecting the life insurance money from that policy, Nick couldn't even be bothered to buy Dawn a headstone. Instead, he took several women that he had been sleeping with shopping for new clothes. A victims' rights organization heard about that, and they decided to buy her one. The congregants showed up to support him. His bond was reduced to $500,000 instead of $750,000 because they did believe him to be a flight risk. On September 17, 2001, Nick entered a plea of not guilty, claiming it was a conspiracy headed by Pastor Robert, who had cursed him. Because of the arson aspect, prosecutors charged him with aggravated murder, which held a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. They began interviewing women he'd had affairs with, and 3 agreed to interviews, including one woman, Nicole, who quickly became uncooperative because she had just gotten engaged to Nick. Prosecutors were forced to get a court order to compel her testimony. The trial date was pushed back a few times as they argued over which evidence they would admit. They argued that the testimony around the affair shouldn't be admitted because they didn't start until after Dawn's death, but that was false. They also argued that Sandy's testimony should be excluded because she had been scorned. The judge didn't agree with these objections. The prosecution argued that he had drugged his wife, suffocated her, and intentionally burned the body and house to cash in on the life insurance policy, citing renovations and debt. They discussed how he didn't buy her a headstone, but they did buy other women clothes. The defense argued the original findings were correct and that the only evidence was one jealous witness, Sandy Glass. The prosecution called 4 women who shed light on the influence of the church and on their lives, including the quote-unquote visions and direct messages from God that people claim to have. Nick used these messages to manipulate them. Lindsay, PB's daughter, talked about how she had been groomed by Nick, and that after Dawn died, he had abused her for a year until she left. All of this was backed up with prolific email exchanges between them. Sandy Glass also testified. The defense talked about how she never warned anyone about Nick and how long it took to come forward. But on December 26, 2002, 5 years to the day, a jury found Nick guilty of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to prison without the possibility of parole. He, of course, insisted on his innocence and gave a non-apology, like they always do. However, in the spring of 2007, the Supreme Court threw out the sentence because he had set the fire after the murder and not during the murder. He was resentenced to 26 years in prison. His sentence will be up in just a few years. There are many warning signs throughout this story, so let's go over them really quick. First, absolute authoritarianism without accountability. Pastor Robert never faced any kind of accountability or consequences for his behavior. They had zero tolerance for criticism or questions. In fact, church members were expelled for questioning. We definitely saw abuse of the church's members, with Nick constantly using his power to sleep with the women in his congregation. And finally, the belief that the leader is the exclusive means of knowing truth or giving validation. We saw this with people claiming that they had direct lines to God and that God spoke to them directly. For more information and resources, visit the International Cultic Studies Association at www.icasahome.com or People Leave Cults at www.peopleleavecults.com. You can also dial 211 for most places within the United States to connect with the United Way's Information and Referral Service, which can direct you to local mental health and social assistance programs. You are not alone. So many of us have been where you are, and we're here for you when you're ready.